In 1629, Anna Schwarz's screams echo through Bamberg Castle as a wooden wedge tears through her body. But this isn't random cruelty, it's calculated profit. By the end of this video, you'll discover the financial conspiracy behind medieval Europe's most sadistic execution method, and why powerful men wanted women to suffer this way. Subscribe right now if you want the full story, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about medieval justice. This isn't just about torture, it's about money, power, and a conspiracy that lasted 400 years. The Spanish donkey stood 7 feet tall. It looked like a simple wooden sawhorse the kind carpenters used to cut wood. But this was no work tool. At the top, where a flat beam should have been, there was a single sharp wooden wedge, and that wedge was angled at exactly 45 degrees. This angle wasn't random. It was carefully measured. At 45 degrees, the wedge could split through soft tissue and muscle, but it would slide around the pelvic bones instead of breaking them. A sharper angle would go too deep, too fast. A flatter angle wouldn't penetrate enough. 45 degrees kept the victim alive longer. The victim was brought in naked. Her wrists were tied behind her back. Executioners lifted her body and positioned her above the wedge. Then, slowly, they lowered her down until the wedge pressed into the perineum, the area between the genitals and the anus. Her own body weight pushed her onto the wood. The device was always made of wood, never metal. Metal would be smooth, metal would be quick, but wood splinters, wood tears, and those splinters would break off inside the body, piercing tissue but sealing small blood vessels at the same time. This stopped heavy bleeding. It kept the victim conscious. It kept her alive. This wasn't some crude medieval cruelty. This was engineering. This was deliberate. Every measurement, every choice of material, every detail was designed with one goal: to make suffering last as long as possible. But the true horror wasn't the device itself. It was who decided which women died on it, and why. In 1627, Katharina Hennet was the richest woman in Cologne, Germany. She owned 4 successful businesses. She owned 2 large manor houses. Her husband had died years earlier, but she didn't remarry. She ran everything herself. She had money, she had power, and that made some people very uncomfortable. One day, church officials accused her of witchcraft. They said she danced with demons at midnight. They said she cursed her neighbors. None of it was true. Katharina had never hurt anyone, but the accusation was made, and that was enough. They arrested her. They stripped her. They put her on the Spanish donkey. For 6 hours, Katharina sat on that wooden wedge. 6 hours of unimaginable pain. The executioners waited for her to confess. They waited for her to admit she was a witch. They waited for her to say anything just to make it stop. But Katharina said nothing. After 6 hours, they pulled her off the device. She was still alive, and she still hadn't confessed. Why did they let her go? Because Katharina had a son. He was a lawyer, a powerful one. He threatened to take the church to civil court. If that happened, all the church's financial records would become public. Everyone would see where the money was going. The church couldn't risk that, so they released her. Catharina didn't just walk away. For the next 3 years, she did something no one else had dared to do. She documented every Spanish donkey execution in Cologne. She wrote down the victim's name. She wrote down what property they owned. She matched every execution to a property seizure. Her ledger still exists today. You can find it in the Cologne City Archives. And what that ledger revealed was a pattern that historians tried to bury for 300 years. In 1998, a historian named Dr. Friedrich Merzbacher decided to look at old execution records from Germany. He studied 847 cases from the years 1627 to 1632. Just 5 years. What he found made him sick. 87% of the women executed on the Spanish donkey owned property. Not just any women, not poor women, not homeless women, women who owned land, women who owned businesses, women who had money. And here's how the system worked. The moment a woman was accused of witchcraft, her property was seized. Not after the trial, not after she was found guilty. Immediately, the church took everything she owned and said they would hold it until the case was resolved. But the case was never resolved in her favor. Let me tell you about Margareta Herber. She lived near Bamberg, Germany. She owned 3 acres of farmland and a textile workshop. She made cloth and sold it. She was doing well. Her husband died. His brother wanted to buy her land. He offered half of what it was worth. Margareta said no. 2 months later, That same brother accused her of witchcraft. On the very same day she was arrested, a property transfer document was written. Before her trial even started, the church had already taken her land. The workshop inventory was sold at auction. The money went to the court. Margareta was put on the Spanish donkey. After 4 hours, she confessed. She admitted to everything they accused her of. Then they burned her at the stake. Her husband's brother bought the land from the church. He paid the same low price he had offered before, half of what it was worth. This exact pattern happened 739 times in Bamberg alone. In just 5 years, the church got the property. Local officials got paid for the trial. The accusers got what they wanted. Everyone made money, except the woman who died. These weren't witch hunts. This was organized crime, but to make this theft machine work, they needed the torture to last long enough for confessions. That required medical precision. In 1577, a Spanish Inquisition torturer named Pedro Ruiz wrote a manual. The title was Métodos Precisos de Ejecución, which means precise methods of execution. This wasn't a book about killing people quickly. It was a book about making them suffer as long as possible. The manual was hidden in the Vatican archives. It stayed there for over 300 years. It wasn't discovered until 1889, and it wasn't translated into English until 1994. Inside, Ruiz explained everything. The wedge had to be angled at exactly 45 degrees, not 40, not 50, exactly 45. Why? Because at that angle, the wedge would push through soft tissue and muscle, but it would slide around the bones. A sharper angle would go too deep and kill too fast. A flatter angle wouldn't go deep enough. The wood was left rough on purpose. When the victim's weight pressed down, splinters would break off inside the body. Those splinters would pierce internal tissue and cause horrible pain, but they were thin enough that they actually sealed small blood vessels. This stopped heavy bleeding. It kept the victim alive longer. Ruiz documented weight distribution. A woman weighing 120 pounds would naturally settle to a certain depth in about 30 minutes. To make the torture last longer, executioners would tie 40-pound weights to her ankles, but never more than 40 pounds. Any heavier, and it would cause fatal internal bleeding too quickly. The goal was to keep her alive for 4 to 6 hours. In 1689, a doctor named Johann Scheltheis published his own observations. He had attended executions and taken notes. He described how tissues separated, how organs shifted inside the body, how muscles failed over time. He wrote about weight, protocols to prevent sudden drops that would cause quick death. The longest recorded survival time was 17 hours and 43 minutes. These weren't random killers. These were doctors, men trained to heal, men who took oaths to save lives, and they became monsters for money. But one man who operated this device for 18 years finally couldn't live with what he'd seen. His name was Hans Schmidt. For 18 years, he was the executioner in Bamberg, Germany. By his own count, he killed 312 women on the Spanish donkey. 312. In 1689, at the age of 56, Hans Schmidt walked into a monastery. He demanded sanctuary, and he handed the abbot a diary. Inside that diary were 847 entries. Each one documented an execution. The victim's name, how long she survived, how much weight was added to her body. Every detail was recorded. But that's not what made this diary special. What made it special was what else Schmidt wrote. Church officials were betting on how long the women would survive. Here's an actual entry from June 17, 1683. Victim Elsa Hoffman, age 44. Crime, witchcraft. Survival time, 5 hours and 22 minutes. Weight added, 35 pounds. Wager placed 50 g. Winner, Canon fled. His guess was 5 hours and 30 minutes. They were gambling. Bishops, canons, church officials, they would place bets before the torture began. They would guess how long a woman would last. The one who guessed closest won the money. Schmidt documented 183 separate betting events between 1671 and 1688. The total amount wagered was over 12,000 guilders. In today's money, that's roughly $3 million. But it gets worse. Schmidt wrote that church officials would sometimes ask him to change the weights during the execution. If a bishop bet the woman would survive 7 hours, but she was dying at 6, they would tell Schmidt to remove weight. This would slow her descent and keep her alive longer. If someone bet on a shorter time, they would add more weight to speed up her death. They were manipulating the torture to win their bets. Hans Schmidt operated that device for 18 years. He killed 312 women with his own hands. And finally, his conscience broke. When this diary went public, Europe exploded. In 1690, Hans Schmidt's diary was published, and Europe lost its mind. Riots broke out across Bavaria. Angry crowds surrounded churches. Windows were smashed. Doors were burned. 3 bishops didn't wait to see what would happen next. They fled to France. The Holy Roman Emperor himself demanded an investigation. How could this have happened? How could church officials gamble on women's lives? In 1692, Pope Innocent XII issued an official ban. The Spanish donkey was now illegal. No one could use it anymore. But here's the part they don't tell you. The Pope didn't ban it because of the cruelty. He didn't ban it because women were being tortured to death. He banned it because the gambling scandal was destroying the church's reputation across Europe. The torture was fine. The betting was the problem. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The ban wasn't enforced. Local officials kept using the device. They just did it in secret. No more public executions. No more records. But the Spanish donkey didn't disappear. The last documented use of the Spanish donkey was in 1874, in a small village in rural Spain. That's 182 years after it was supposedly banned. After 1692, churches across Europe began systematically destroying execution records. They burned documents. They erased names. They eliminated evidence. Most of what we know today only exists because people like Katharina Hennett and Hans Schmidt kept their own records and hid them. A few original Spanish donkey devices still exist. They're locked away in museum storage rooms. The official reason museums don't display them: too disturbing for general audiences. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is that these devices are physical proof. Proof of systematic murder disguised as justice. Proof that the church killed thousands of women to steal their property. And that truth is still too uncomfortable for institutions to admit. The Spanish donkey died in 1874, but its legacy lives on in ways you might not expect. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 women died on the Spanish donkey across Europe from 1490 to 1874, nearly 400 years, but we'll never know the real number. After 1692, most execution records were destroyed. The names were erased. The evidence was burned. What we know today only exists because a few people refused to stay silent. Katharina Hennett kept her ledger. Hans Schmidt kept his diary. Those documents survived, and because they survived, we know the truth. In 1948, the United Nations created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 5 says, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment." That sentence exists because of the Spanish donkey. It exists because of the Iron Maiden, the rack, the Judas cradle, and every other torture device used during the Inquisition. World leaders looked back at history and said, "Never again." The United States Constitution has the 8th Amendment. It says the government cannot use cruel and unusual punishment. The men who wrote that amendment had studied the Inquisition. They knew what happened in Europe. They knew about devices like the Spanish donkey, and they made sure it could never happen in America. The Geneva Conventions, international law, the entire framework of human rights that protects us today, all of it was built on the graves of women like Anna Margareta Herber, and the 847 victims documented in Hans Schmidt's diary. Their suffering wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. It forced humanity to ask a question: what will we never accept? What lines will we never cross? And the answer to that question became law. These women didn't choose to be martyrs. They didn't volunteer to change history. They were tortured and killed because powerful men wanted their land. But their deaths exposed a truth that could not be ignored. Institutions will abuse power unless we create rules to stop them. Modern human rights law exists because we looked back at what happened and said it can never happen again. Every protection we have today was written in someone's blood. Which brings us to the question that should keep you awake. Tonight, imagine you're living in Bavaria in the 1680s. You know what's happening. You've seen women accused. You've watched their property disappear. You've heard the screams from the castle. You know it's wrong. But if you speak out, you might be next. Catharina Hennett survived because she had protection. Her son was a powerful lawyer. He could fight back. Most people didn't have that protection. Hans Schmidt operated the Spanish donkey for 18 years. He killed 312 women. And then, finally, he broke his silence. But it took 18 years and 312 deaths. Most people stayed silent, not because they were evil, but because silence meant survival. So here's the question: what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have risked your life, your family, your future to expose what was happening? Or would you have stayed quiet and hoped it wouldn't happen to you? This isn't just a historical question. Every generation faces this choice in different forms. When institutions abuse power, when injustice happens in front of us, when speaking up comes with a real cost, what do? It's easy to say we'd be brave. It's easy to judge people from the past and think, I would have done something. But when your safety, your income, your family's future is on the line, the choice becomes much harder. Understanding why good people do nothing helps us understand ourselves. It helps us recognize the moments in our own lives when we stay silent because it's safer. So I want to ask you again, what would you have done? Really, think about it. Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. Would you have been Katharina? Would you have been Hans Schmidt? Or would you have been one of the thousands who stayed silent? The Spanish donkey didn't work because of a few evil men. It worked because entire communities allowed it to happen. Executioners operated the device. Church officials placed their bets, but think about everyone else involved. Notaries wrote the property seizure documents. Witnesses testified in fake trials. Buyers purchased the stolen land. Judges signed the execution orders. Guards brought the women to the torture chambers. Crowds gathered to watch. This wasn't a secret. It was public. It was normal. It was how things worked. That's the real horror. Systems of oppression don't require evil masterminds. They require ordinary people who participate, stay silent, or look the other way. Some historians try to suppress these stories, not because the stories were false, but because they reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. They show how quickly violence becomes normal when institutions have unchecked power. But we remember these stories for a reason. We remember because we refuse to repeat them. Every human right we have today was written in someone's blood. The right to a fair trial, the right to be free from torture, the right to own property without fear of theft. These protections exist because women like Anna Schwarz, Margareta Herber, and thousands of others suffered and died. They didn't die for nothing. They died so we could define what never again means, that their names deserve to be remembered, not just as victims, but as the reason we have laws that protect us today. Their suffering built the foundation of modern human rights, and that legacy will outlive every institution that tried to erase them. I know this was disturbing to watch. It was disturbing to research. But if this affected you, that's the point. History should disturb us. It should make us uncomfortable. Because when we forget what happened, we risk letting it happen again. If you want more uncomfortable truths that textbooks hide, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to telling the real stories, the ones that institutions tried to erase, the ones that reveal how power actually works, and the ones that show us why our rights matter. Next, I'm covering the Judas Creedalin, other torture device that historians tried to remove from history. It's just as calculated, just as horrifying, and just as tied to profit and power as the Spanish donkey. You won't want to miss it. Tell me what you think in the comments. Would you have spoken out in 1680s Bavaria? Do you think we've learned from this history, or are we repeating it in different forms? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think. These stories matter, these names matter, and as long as people are willing to listen, I'll keep telling them. I'll see you in the next one.